cannabidiol for treatment for them to try to reduce the burden of the seizures that they're experiencing. That meeting took place in April, as I was mentioning. The governor held a press conference on the 10th. It was a partnership with Representative Steve from the USG, and he announced a state initiative to be led by Georgia Regents University to conduct a scientific study of treating children with medication-resistant epilepsy with cannabidiol. Over the next month or two at that point, we initiated a fact-finding mission to try to figure out how do we go about this. Where are we able to get cannabidiol? Who are the physicians that would be able to participate in such a study? And other information that would be critical to the design and development of these processes, which we'll be sharing here with you today. Among the things that we looked into were the feasible options for acquiring pharmaceutical-grade cannabidiol, CBD, to conduct these clinical trials. We also looked into the farm, which NIDA, that's Institute for Drug Abuse, has established a partnership with the University of Mississippi, and the potential for acquiring the cannabidiol from them. At that point, they were just then starting to grow with their first crop of marijuana, which would be high in cannabidiol. Their prior crops have been higher in THC, which is another one of the 100 or so cannabinoids that are in marijuana. And it was at this time of the year that they would be harvesting their first crop. And in fact, speaking with their lead investigator last week, they have just completed the harvesting of their first crop. And they are in the process of drying it, but their contract with NIDA did not include actually extracting the cannabidiol from any of the processing. NIDA has since issued an RFP, a request for applications, which they have applied for, and we will hear at the end of March. I was informed whether or not they will be successful in their request, their submission, to be able to do the next level of studies to continue to grow the marijuana there, as well as do the next step as far as beginning to extract the cannabidiol, the purification processes that are necessary, the other steps that would be necessary to make that into a medication that could be given to children. So they are a ways off at this point from being able to be a source for us for the study that we were anxious to start in Georgia at a much sooner time than probably end of next year at the earliest. We looked at a number of other options, and what we identified was that probably our best option for a timely initiation study was to work with a company by the name of GW Pharmaceuticals, which is based out of the UK. We had conversations with them. They were very receptive to working with us to put together the protocols and the processes so that we would be able to acquire the cannabidiol to be able to treat children in Georgia who are afflicted with this very incapacitated disorder. In June of this year, following up with these conversations with GW Pharmaceuticals and with Governor Deal's office, in fact, a memorandum of understanding was signed between three entities, Georgia Regents University being the third, to form a partnership to be able to look at the opportunity for providing the medication to the children here in Georgia. Why Georgia Regents? Georgia Regents University is Georgia's public research university. The university was founded in 2013 by the merger of two universities, Georgia Health Science University, which is down the hill where surrounding the Children's Hospital of Georgia, which you visited this morning, and what was Augusta State University, which is the campus that we're sitting on now. Georgia Regents University includes 9 colleges: Allied Health Sciences, Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Dental Medicine, Education, the Graduate School, Nursing, Science, Mathematics, and Medical College of Georgia. Medical College of Georgia was founded in 1928 and is the 13th oldest medical school in the country. Georgia Regents Health System includes the Adult Medical Center, includes the Children's Hospital of Georgia, the Cancer Center, and the Dental Center, and other components as well. Why GW Pharmaceuticals? Our thought processes, the things that we considered in making that decision, included the items that are listed here. GW Pharmaceuticals has a world-leading position in the development of plant-derived cannabinoid therapeutics. It is a proprietary cannabinoid product platform, which discussions today are about use of children with intractable epilepsy, but also potentially can be used to treat a variety of other disease areas, and those will require further investigation as well. GW Pharmaceuticals has a proven record of both FDA and DEA applications, which are going to be very important for us to be able to do research studies actually any place in the country. So that track record actually will save us a lot of time, as well as considerable amount of funding if we were going to have to do all the preclinical studies that they have already accomplished. We were going to have to redo all those. GW Pharmaceuticals does have partnerships with other major pharmaceutical companies and does have collaborations with many other universities around the world. And as I've indicated, they were very willing and eager to work with State of Georgia and Georgia Regents University, the team that we put together of other participating sites across the state for this important project. GW Pharmaceuticals does have a product by the name of Sativex, which is commercialized. It's used for patients who have multiple sclerosis, and it's approved in 24 countries around the world, and is in late phase 3 with studies for cancer pain in the United States. Phase 3 is the final stages that would be required before the FDA will identify whether or not they'll approve it for use in the United States. So they're very late in that process. They have also promising clinical stage cannabinoid product pipelines, which includes treatments for other conditions for which we also don't have good answers. And these include type 2 diabetes, ulcerative colitis, schizophrenia, and cancer. And they have an orphan program, orphan drug and special things to the FDA as far as requirements of what has to be done in order to be able to get FDA approval. But they had an orphan program for the use of cannabinoids for pediatric treatment of children with pediatric epilepsy, which they had already initiated with the FDA. GW had a 6-year history of pre-research in cannabinoids relating to epilepsy, and they have 2 products that they're particularly looking at. The one that is farther along in development is Epidiolex, which is their brand name for their form of the molecule cannabidiol. It does have FDA formal orphan development, which provides advantages about what needs to be done as indicated to get approval. They have already worked with the FDA and been able to provide expanded access INDs with an indication to allow use of the medication for use of Epidiolex for children with intractable epilepsy in many states throughout the country, as well as one here in Georgia. And they have extensive preclinical and clinical safety data already in place. So they have a considerable amount of experience in the work that they've already done with their Sativex product, as well as I'll share with you a little bit, which provides safety data about the use of this medication in children. And while for Epidiolex for children with intractable epilepsy is still anecdotal evidence, nonetheless it provides a level of reassurance which I think will be important in the FDA's responsiveness and willingness to allow us to proceed with our study here in Georgia. Cannabidiol also questions include how does it work. It has many different types of properties. These include anti-inflammatory, anti-convulsive, antioxidant, and neuroprotective. And I'll share with you a little bit of basic science data about this. But at this point, with the promising results that we've seen in some of the children who have received cannabidiol from their individual care providers, the benefits that we're seeing, we don't really know which of these mechanisms are cannabidiol is derived. It has very carefully controlled conditions as far as the temperature that's in the room, the amount of sunlight that's in the room. They can regulate that, the amount of watering of the plants that occurs, and they also do very careful controls of the actual strain of the plant that's being grown. And they take clones from the existing plants in order to be able to get continued production and growth of plants that will have similar characteristics time and time again, so that the medication that ultimately will derive will have similar characteristics, so you won't have batch variation in the molecules that are there, and therefore that batch variation could result in different outcomes for the children as they were taken.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Maybe the prosecutor might have a question about this. So this particular location where it's from is in Great Britain. Correct. So to transport it into the United States to the customs illegal substance, how do they circumvent that?
Yes, I don't know that I can fully answer that question. We could find it out for you. But there are, as I'll share, multiple studies that have been done with their product in the United States.
So they're already doing it?
So they're already doing that.
They
have those processes in place. They're actually shipping their clearinghouse or distribution center, I guess you say, is in the middle of the country, it's in Kansas City at this point. And so they have those processes, which obviously involve the DEA, the enforcement agency, and other agencies.
So there's a path.
So there's a very well-defined pathway that's been worked out in conjunction with authorities from a legal point of view, actually.
It does actually. I've written the question down, but I believe those are right there. So, if I understand your testimony, Doctor, the best and most efficient means to get this study started is to buy this product that's already been grown and extracted in another country that we figured out how to get it here. And in fact, you said Mississippi is a year or two behind even getting to that point, correct? Where they started growing it themselves and extracting it. That's a step backwards.
Yeah, they had, to my knowledge, what they've told me, they have already started the extracting process.
So growing or not growing marijuana in this state is not going to interfere with your ability to get this study started.
From my way of thinking, it shouldn't. There may be legal issues that I'm not aware of, but from a medical point of view, a research point of view, it should, growing it marijuana in this state should not affect our ability to do the study. That's not our intent. We're intending to get the medication from GW Pharmaceuticals, which has been produced in Great Britain.
Thanks, sir.
Okay. So they have specific marijuana plants which they have evolved over time as they go through their husbandry processes in order to come up with a plant that is high in cannabidiol, low in THC, and some of the other cannabinoids. As I mentioned, there are many different cannabinoids in marijuana itself, and of these, there's only one, which is the THC, which is known for a psychoactive effect that some individuals like to use for recreational purposes. Also, obviously, there are medical conditions for which it may be advantageous as well. Cannabinoids are capable of targeting diseases across a variety of different therapeutic areas. What I mentioned, some of the conditions for which it's been evaluated. And these can be going through a number of different systems, the cannabinoid system, the adenosine uptake system, serotonin receptor system, so many different mechanisms by which these effects may be manifested. And what GW Pharmaceuticals has done is they have an in-house formulation for growing, harvesting, processing, manufacturing, and all the regulatory components that are needed in order to make the medication, which is a liquid, which would then be used in the studies that we will initiate here in Georgia. This is something that they have many patents for as well, which include some of the manufacturing processes. As I've alluded to, they have strict control both for growing conditions, very highly regulated facilities, starting materials, so clones of plants that they are utilizing. They have specific technology which produces extracts of pure compounds. And the graph on the upper right look at reproducibility over a 5-year period of time. On the left-hand side is 2004, and on the far right-hand side will be 2009. And this is concentrations of cannabidiol in different lots of the early stage of the extract as they're going through the production processes. And you can see that it's falling into a very narrow window of concentrations. They've also fully characterized the constituents of the extract to the same sort of rigorous standards as other medications or pharmaceutical drugs would be done. And they have quality control steps for each of these steps in the manufacturing process which is already in place. And they have conformance to detailed specifications which they have worked on with FDA and agreed to for a fingerprint for the product. And chromatogram, which is a representation of many different molecules, again, in early stage development. This is 25 chromatograms that are overlaid, and they look like a single one. You don't see a lot of variation. You see very consistent peak heights and peak locations on that graph, which speak to the consistency of the product that they're starting with as they're going to develop a cannabidiol product, which ultimately will be what we would be providing to the children.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
That standardization of the product, so, and I'm sure everyone over there, they gave you all the chemical components, is that going to be acceptable to the research community in the United States and to the FDA and to the NIH and all of the approval agencies? Are they going to recognize that standardization as being proper?
Sure. So probably the best way I can answer that is to say that they have shared this information with FDA, and on the basis of that information, number one, FDA has allowed these expanded access studies to go on at multiple places across the country. Additionally, they have applied for their own IND to be conducting studies across the country to try to get approval to market this medication. And in May of this year, they received approval from the FDA based on exactly that sort of information, the chemical characterization, how they're producing their product. They received permission from FDA to do a phase 2 study for a very specific type of intractable epilepsy called Dravet syndrome, and a phase 2 study, and then 2 types of phase 3 studies, one also for Dravet syndrome, and the other is for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And so FDA has accepted what they have provided. I'm not privy to what questions FDA may have asked and what the company responded to, but the bottom line was ultimately FDA has given approval for these phase 2 and phase 3 studies, the IND for those studies to proceed in order to examine the efficacy or how much it helps people, as well as the safety of these medications for children with intractable epilepsy with those 2 specific conditions.
You're only doing Dravet, right?
The study that we are hoping to do in the state of Georgia through the governor's initiative will not be Dravet. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But basically, there will be studies, and there are sites in Georgia that which will be participating in those studies for children specifically with Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut. The governor, we're all interested in trying to provide this to all, or as many children as possible who have intractable epilepsy. And so we specifically designed our studies to focus on children who would not be eligible for these other studies, so that these families would be able to either go to the company studies or to the study that we're hoping to initiate in order to provide coverage for as many different children as possible who are having significant amount of seizures and have not been able to be treated and regulated well with other medications that they've been receiving.
Okay.
All right. Just want to say a couple words about medical marijuana, and specifically to try to draw a distinction from something that I think is very important from the point of research and also from a physician who is giving a medication to a patient where we're trying to help them. Things that are important to me in that medication that I rely upon in the drugs that I get and that I'm prescribing. So when individuals talk about medical marijuana, it can be many, many different things, and it may vary from person to person as to what they mean with that definition. Medical marijuana often will include compositions which include THC within them, and depending on the specific strain of marijuana that's being grown, it can have a variety of different concentrations of THC that's present, and that can also vary with cultivation conditions and storage conditions. And why that's important is that what's being grown a year ago or 6 months ago or today or 6 months from now may not be consistent. If we're giving it as a medicine to an individual, they may be getting different things at different times, which may not either show the benefit, may have some undesirable effects, may have less interaction with other medications they're taking, and the way that their body handles them, experience with the liver or the kidneys. Marijuana that's being utilized for recreational purposes often has been grown and developed to have high concentrations of THC, and for the purposes of a product which is a high CBD concentration, that's not what we're looking for. Mechanism of delivery is also important as to the blood levels that are achieved, and able then to get to the brain to be able to have benefits for epilepsy. And that may vary with whether it's smoked or vaporized or it's in food or drinks. And when consumed in those different methods, again, there may be variation in the amount of active medication that's actually getting into the body, and then the blood concentrations are achieved. So that also provides another location for variability. And then there's the potential for contamination with microbes, bacteria, in other words, or heavy metals, or pesticides, or other compounds, if the growth and the manufacturing processes are regulated. Processes which go for medications that go through through FDA, have very specific specifications which are shared, they're subject to inspection by FDA to make sure those are being adhered to, and provide greater assurance for patients that the medication they're getting would not have these sorts of contaminants present. Another topic regarding medical marijuana is distribution. How does it take place? It's often done through collectives or cooperatives as opposed to pharmacies. There also is the potential that there will be limited collection of adverse event or systematic efficacy data that's collected, and therefore it may be difficult or impossible to know who is really benefiting or being harmed from the medication. What we may hear is individual anecdotal evidence as opposed to what's happened to populations at a much larger sense. Medical advice in these situations can be given by untrained or unlicensed individual. They can have efficacy claims which are broader than there's data to substantiate and confirm. Often it's being done without meaningful physician supervision. It results in individuals stopping the other medications that the physicians are taking that can have adverse effects on these children as well. And there is concern that without labeling, people may not be aware of the risks that are associated with it or instructions for use. And then another concern also relates to insurance and the ability to get insurance to help cover medication, which is a benefit for a health condition. And this is a picture just to depict conditions that are growing in the upper left, which may be less standardized, the drying, different means of becoming available, the plant itself or drinks, throughout the slide in different forms of for consumption in the lower right-hand corner as well. All right, so the question to bring this portion of my discussion to conclusion, I want to make a distinction between medical marijuana, cannabidiol oil, cannabidiol as a molecule, cannabidiolates, because I do not think these are synonymous. And I think often when people speak, and I actually had an opportunity to speak with two individuals yesterday who were using a term, and I actually asked them what they meant, and I would have meant something different by that term. And so I think as we have these discussions, it's very important to know what we're talking about. Medical marijuana to me means marijuana in pretty much any form it may be, being consumed in any of the fashions that I just described and others as well. And that's probably the broadest of these characterizations. Within medical marijuana, it is a group of compounds that we call cannabidiol oil. And to me, I think of these as compounds which are enriched in cannabidiol. They have high cannabidiol concentrations, but may have many other cannabinoids as well. They have many other types of molecules as well, and there are many other types of molecules that come in the marijuana plants. And so it's a very heterogeneous solution, even though the primary ingredient probably is cannabidiol. Then you have cannabidiol itself, which is a specific unique molecule, and then epidiolex, which is the specific, that's still that same specific molecule, but that's the trade name for the cannabidiol that's been manufactured by UW Pharmaceuticals. All right, and I've alluded to this a little before, but again, to show you some of the things involved in production. So on the upper left, we have plants that are in a very controlled situation for temperature, light. They actually have fans which blow on the plants, move the leaves and the stems. Highly controlled drying conditions as far as temperature and humidity, which see in the upper middle. Very consistent processes for extraction, which you see on the upper right. Fully automated systems for GMP, good manufacturing practice, manufacturing processes, leading to automated GMP labeling and packing services, and then a product that you see on the lower right.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
When you visited GW Pharmaceuticals, did they give you a kind of a broad amount of what their R&D investment has been so far?
Not that I recall. They're a publicly traded company, so that ought to be available, but I don't know the answer to that. Sorry. All right, so excuse me. So cannabinoids, including cannabidiol, CBD, has a variety of different targets or places that we be targeting. These include what are called endocannabinoid receptors, which inhibit release of excitatory neurotransmitter. In individuals who have epilepsy, often they will have increased levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, which leads to many neurons within the brain discharging at once and will lead into the epileptic seizure. Their cannabinoids have an opportunity to modulate and functionally mimic these actions. Target both the endocannabinoid system as well as non-endocannabinoid targets. These include not only cannabinoids but also serotonin, melatonin, orphoreceptors, and also they can affect this pathway by inhibition of adenosine reuptake. Another target is for role for inflammation in epilepsy, and currently the medications that are available, none of them identify their mechanisms of actions as related to inflammation, but there is some evidence that cannabinoids, such as cannabidiol, are potent anti-inflammatory agents, antioxidants, and have a protective effect during neuroinflammation, which inhibit the release of cytokines, leading to greater inflammation and greater than seizure activity. And then there are also differences in ion channels, which include leptogenesis, or leading to seizures, and these include both different types of channels through which anions and cations would be traversed, and the cannabinoids also can affect these channels, thereby limiting the seizure activity. There have been some studies that have been done looking at anti-seizure activity in brain slices, and these are looking at sheets of confluent hippocampal neurons. Hippocampus is one portion of the brain. There are agents that can be given which would normally trigger synchronized bursts of electrical activity in these cells, and they appear to be very similar to what is done when this is invoked in vivo in normal or naturally occurring circumstances. The middle portion of the slide is looking at two agents. It's not really important what the agents are, but for each of these, you can see on the left-hand side, when you add this agent in the absence of cannabidiol or the absence of CBD, you see the large changes in discharge that occurs, as evidenced by the amount of red on the left-hand slide for each of these figures. And in the presence of cannabidiol, you see how those the extent of those discharges decrease, which would lead to less of the seizure activity. This is a slide which is looking at information of three different types of activities in animals that give either cannabidiol or anti-epileptic medications, and they look at motor coordination. So if we look at the top, which is looking at balance, the left-hand bar is the sailing, and as animals are asked to walk across a beam, they can do so very well. If they're given increasing concentration of alpha, which is the pink and reddish colors, you can see that their ability to walk across that without falling off decreases considerably. If they're given ethosuximide, which is the yellowish and brownish, you see at the higher concentration that's going down. And if they're given phenobarbital, another very common agent that's given to these children to try to control their seizures, you can see a very precipitous decrease in how far these animals can walk before they fall off. In contrast, if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that with cannabidiol, this is not impaired. The middle portion and the bottom portion look at other types of assessments such as this, the length of the bar that the animals are able to traverse, the number of foot slips that they identify, and for each of these, you can see that there's much greater impairment in the presence of these other anti-epileptic medications than is the case with cannabidiol. And so, with these other medications, it may be helping to control their seizures, but one of the detrimental side effects is it affects other activity, other parts of the daily life and activities of these children. And the hope is that with cannabidiol, these results from these animal studies will be able to carry over to that would help with their seizures, and may also be able to do so without having deleterious effects on other functions and other activities. And this slide is just to summarize many of the different types of beneficial effects which have been identified in different types of models for cannabidiol, which include anti-inflammatory, anti-ischemic, so minimizing the reduction of oxygen levels in the tissue, relaxing vessels, reducing spasms of muscles, immune suppression, analgesic, anxiolytic, antipsychotic, and neuroprotective effects. Next portion I want to talk very briefly about is about THC and what I've been able to gather in literature in talking with others who are more knowledgeable than I am about this area of medicine, but potential concerns about THC as an agent for these children. So there is something called a CB1 receptor, which is activated by THC, which normally contributes to the directional growth of neurons, and this plays a functional role in the formation of cortical circuitry. THC interferes with cell structure and protein turnover in neurons, and therefore there have been suggestions that it should be avoided during pregnancy so it doesn't affect those growth in the developing baby. It can also, it's also been reported to affect exposure to fetal slices of mice, fetal brain slices of mice, and that it distorts sensory responsiveness and affects visual development. In human fetuses, cannabis exposure has been shown to reduce nerve growth in the brain. Regarding epilepsy, THC modulation affects the fetal nervous system and can lead to unexpected outcomes as a main adult. And instead of acting as the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the adult, in the presence of this GABA, which is one of the transmitters, it often ends up becoming excitatory, which may lead to seizure activity. And there is also evidence that low-dose THC increases the amplitude of electrically evoked cortical potentials, which they also lead to seizures.
Can I ask you
Yes, please.
Not a prediction.
We have not explicitly put that into our protocol. We are providing for the opportunity for prolonged administration of the study for up to a year. Again, based on physician input and input of the family if they would want to do so. We do have assessments of the child throughout that period as assessed both by the healthcare provider as well as by family members, which indirectly address the question that you're asking about. But we have not put it, we had a lot of discussions about how much should we put in serial MRIs, the image brain, those sorts of things. And
because the other is still
we could do that. The question was, number one, cost associated with that. Number two, the burden on the family, these families and their children, particularly if there are other children, to have them come in at periodic time for those exams. And so we did not put that into the study at this point in time. It might be something we could still add in for a subgroup of individuals, and when the parents have the opportunity to come in for those sorts of evaluations, scientifically, I think that would be very valuable to do.
Well, would it be fair to say that the study is not that sophisticated that it is going into that range of
The study,
215.
yeah. So the study, as it's now written, is not going to. There are all sorts of evaluations of CNS function that could be done.
Right.
Again, for the reasons I just mentioned, while we discussed some of them,
Cost prohibitive?
the consensus was we ought to remove it from a cost point of view,
Uh-huh.
as well as from the burden it would place on these families to have to come for those evaluations. But if there was an opportunity for the three-year committees for us to add those back in for even some subpopulations so we could learn more information, I would be thrilled for us to do that.
We're getting close to our time. So
All right.
Once you finish your
All right.
presentation, I know we got a bunch of questions for you.
All right. So, bottom line of the slide, there's some evidence that THC may have detrimental effects. That's controversial. There are others that think THC, a little bit of THC is beneficial. My reading literature suggests that it's not. Epidiolex, formulation we have is specifically cannabidiol. I'm going to go quickly here. I've already shared that the company is looking specifically at Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and has received their IND to move forward. They had an initial release of information from their initial expanded access children in June. They've had a more recent report that came out in October. In October of last month, the European Union granted orphan designation for Dravet syndrome, and the phase 2-3 clinical trials for Dravet initiated. GW had a press release last month in which they identified 12-week continuous exposures to children. 9 of them were being cared for at UCSF in San Francisco, 26 at NYU in New York, and 23 in Boston. These are children that had been treatment resistant and young adults, mean age of 11. They were continuing on their current medications. They were taking at least 3 other anti-epileptic medications to which the Epidiolex was added. These patients included individuals with extreme and rare forms of epilepsy, including a subset of children with major congenital structural brain abnormalities. 16-week data was presented for all 40 children, and they have a total safety database of 151 patients, which totals about 50 patient years. This is taken directly from their presentation or press release. This is looking at percent seizure reduction. So however many children's seizures the children were having initially, what was happening after 4 weeks, and you can see it was reduced overall by 40%. That was consistent also at weeks 5 to 8, which is the second bar, weeks 9 to 12, which is the third bar, and they had a little bit greater improvement over half the children who were having the median reduction in seizures was 51% at 13 to 16 weeks. Now this slide is looking at those same children, but looking at the percent reduction that they have. So the dark blue at the very bottom of each of these are skims up 4 weeks, up to 8 weeks, up to 12 weeks, up to 16 weeks. The bottom portion here is looking at those children that are seizure-free, and roughly there's about 10% of each of these times. Those that had at least a 90% response, 90% reduction, varies a little bit, roughly 20%, 70% reduction, about 30%, and about 50% reduction was roughly about 40% or up to 55% at the end. This slide is looking at the same information, but specifically the subpopulation that have Dravet syndrome. And you see the benefit that they achieved. The first 4 weeks it was about 70%. It didn't hold up quite so well as you went a little bit farther, but still seems to be leveled off at 16 weeks to around 50% mean reduction in impulsive seizures. And this slide is looking at percentage of seizure improvement, and roughly 20 to 30% for seizure-free in these time periods. You can see the numbers across different for other levels of reduction. This is the data again for a very specific subgroup of 12 individuals who had an atonic or drop seizures. The median percent reductions in the same time periods, averaging about 50%, a little bit higher at the end. And again, those that were seizure-free or responders in 50, 70, or 90 percentiles. So this is anecdotal being collected from these individuals, not being done in a systematic fashion. And that's really the difference from what we're going to be doing in the larger studies that we hope to conduct. We hope to be able to assess this in a very systematic fashion to get much better quality evidence about, number one, efficacy as far as seizure reduction, impact upon other quality of life issues, as well as safety of doing so. There were some adverse events that they identified in these children. Somnolescence or feeling tired or drowsiness was probably the most common, in 19%. Fatigue was second most common, in 11%. There were 2 children that actually withdrew during the study due to adverse events. Also 4 withdrawals due to lack of clinical effects. And 26 individuals. There were, however, no serious adverse effects that were deemed that were related to the Epidiolex or the Epidiolex itself. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through the summary, and I'm going to get now to Dr. Park, who's going to give his presentation, and I'll go back to Dr. Park.
Okay, let's Dr. Park, come on up. You can come on up and have a seat for a minute, and I think there may be some questions that the committee may have. Dr. Park, do you got a presentation as well too? Do you have a slide presentation you want to go through as well too? Okay. Well, if it's just a few minutes, then why don't we go ahead and proceed with yours, and then we'll see both of you.
She wanted to answer a question. I'm part of the committee. I'm a pediatrician and a neuroscientist.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I think we're having you come. Why don't you come? It's almost 2 o'clock, so we'll kind of get to this part. So, Dr. Park, in the interest of time, why don't you proceed with your presentation, and then we'll have some questions, open up for questions to the whole panel. Is that okay? That work?
In terms of the definitions of seizures, a seizure is one event from the uncontrollable excitations of the brain that give you a seizure. But you have to have a recurrent seizure in order to make decisions of the diagnosis of epilepsy. That's the concept. The seizure can occur from the many other reasons, but epilepsy means you have to have a spontaneous recurrent seizure. That's what we call epilepsy. And then, in terms of instance, before this morning, somebody asked me about epilepsy is a general population of about 1%. With that information, the U.S. children, as you see in the top of the slide, epilepsy is about 466,000 the epilepsy. Among those is the pharmacoresistance. That means we call intractable. That give you about 20% from the generous estimation in here. And then target U.S. population is about intractable means 93,000 in children. among those, Dravet is a very small subset, Lennox-Gastaut also a small set of epileptic syndrome. Let me move on to the general concept of this. Here, when you have an epilepsy, the doctor prescribes medications in order to control the recurrent seizures. So this is a pie slide overall, not only the children. Overall, VA and other adult and children all studied from the Scotch Rite. As you see here, the first drug demonstrates about 47% you can achieve seizure freedom. If it's not seizure freedom yet, the doctor put in the second medication or change second medications. Once you put in the second medication, the expectation seizure freedom achieve about 13%. By that time, if you put in the number 3, number 4, number 5, the achieve of seizure freedom is a minimum, like 1%. That means, as a doctors, now we said is you have intractable, refractory, because you already tried more than 2, still having seizure. That means that category, that population will be reported refractory seizures. Then what you do? You don't have to spend time to number 3, 4, 5, 6 without expecting any seizure freedom achieved. That means you have to move on to other methodology to helping for children or adults. So that means what kinds of studies are available. You know, the top epileptic drug is number 1, always Dr. put in. And if it's intractable, then you move on ketogenic diet, vagus nerve stimulator, responsive therapy, epilepsy surgery. You have to refer to epilepsy surgery. Then, what is the CBD is placed in? So let me, CBD will be here, But CBD is not necessarily initial medication. You got to establish a medication to achieve seizure freedom, but if it's not, then it's about the 20-25% population in children. Then you can use either CBD or other methods which I mentioned, epilepsy surgery, evaluation, etc., etc. So CBD can be placed in any kind of time of frame while you're investigating of epilepsy surgery and other, etc. So it's not necessarily CBD is the initial medication for seizure epilepsy. So that's we should keep in mind, and then what kinds of the data we can achieve, and what kind of seizure pattern responds to good or not, what kinds of cause of a seizure is response to better to CBD or not. Once we have a more populations study in future, we could come up with, oh yeah, this type of seizure is best for seizure, or this type of underlying pathology is best or not good to CBD. We might begin to have understand better in the near future. So let me stop here and there.
Okay, Dr. Park, thank you. And Dr. Whitmore, am I pronouncing it right? Okay. Why don't you add a couple comments if you have some for the committee, and then we'll go on to some questions, okay? If you'll tell us your background a little bit.
Yes, sir. Yes, my name is Cynthia Wetmore. I am on faculty at Emory University. I'm an associate professor of pediatrics and of pediatric oncology. I am trained, my undergraduate was at Harvard University. My medical school training was at the University of Minnesota. I also did a PhD in basic neurobiology, neuroscience at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and I have expertise in epilepsy biology and biology studies. I also did training in neuro-oncology, and I take care of children with cancer. I also take care of children with seizures. I've been on faculty at the Mayo Clinic and also most recently 8 years at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And my interest in this is because I've had many patients who have been taking different forms of cannabidiol. I think anecdotally it has helped some of them. And I'm new to Emory, I'm new to Georgia, and part of my interest in coming here was to really do some rigorous clinical studies to find out in what areas it is safe and effective, and really try to bring this resource to our families that are suffering.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. You've seen use of cannabidiol in other states where it's legal. Is that?
Well, that's not so some of my patients at St. Jude travel to Colorado and other places to bring it back. Now, that's a murky area. We are not doing that at Children's in Atlanta. We are very strictly adhering, but we do know that our families bring it in their car when they drive back.
You've been seeing them and treating them and at least observing?
I have been caring for them and trying to help them understand some of the side effects, but this has not been at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. This is my prior role at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital.
So where are you based now?
At Children's Hospital of Atlanta. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory University. I'm faculty at Emory, and the reason I'm involved is I'm also the director of the entire clinical and translational research program at Emory and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And I'm involved also with my own research and medically in caring for children with epilepsy and cancer.
Okay. We've got three very smart, brilliant people folks in front of us, and so I know we've got a lot of questions for you, so if you'll hang with us for a minute. If I can, just a couple of comments. And I think we all understand the importance, and I think we've seen today the FDA approval process and understanding from the medical community the importance of it. Let me just ask the question, though. I mean, it is true that there's no guarantee that Epidiolex is going to work. Is that correct? I mean, there is a possibility that we go down this whole path and Epidiolex doesn't work. I mean, is that not true?
So the data that I just shared with you is probably the largest amount of data that we have about anecdotal, as I noted, for Epidiolex for treatment of children with intractable epilepsy. And I was showing you the percentage of children that were benefited and how much they benefited. But the converse to that, the ones that weren't represented there, our children did not see benefit.
Right. So, I mean, I hope it does work. I mean, we're pulling for this as a positive effect, but my point is, there are FDA drugs, as we've proven with anti-epileptic drugs, that don't work. There are some that have been gone through the process, approved by the FDA, there are also FDA drugs gone through the process and then get pulled off the market years later because they have found to have some side effect. My point is, I just want to make sure while we support the process that you're going through here, and is with all due respect, we are so grateful for what you're doing. Just because it's going down an FDA track doesn't guarantee its success. Is that not true? Could you walk us through very quickly, I know Dr. Park, I asked you this today, timing of how many citizens and children are involved in the clinical trial so far in Georgia, and what your anticipated timing over the next, say, 12 to 18 months, 24 months, of how many would be available to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, so those are the additional parts of the presentation that I have.
Okay.
Specifically addressed, which I can try to go through.
Can you hit that very quickly? I think it's important to this committee is, that yes, that this is a path that we support and embrace, but we also want to make sure it's timely.
A quick answer is it's at the FDA right now. We hope to hear back. We should have heard back within 30 days. It's going through the institutional review boards. We hope to have it open in a couple of months.
Meaning open?
Enrolling patients.
And meaning open to a limited amount, or to anyone?
Children with intractable epilepsy that do not have Lennox-Gastaut or Dravet, but at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, we are also opening the Lennox Dravet. So we'll have both of them open. So the children, if they do have the syndrome or if they do not have the syndrome, we will be able to care for them.
And that will be an unlimited amount. In other words, anyone who would come forward would be able to participate in that trial.
Well, I can't guarantee an unlimited amount. We have safety standards, so you enroll a cohort of patients, 3 to 6, and then you observe those for the next 2 months to make sure that it's safe and nothing unusual, untoward would happen, and then you open it to another cohort.
So if I'm hearing you right, then maybe even in early 2015,
correct,
you would anticipate being able to have a lot of Georgia citizens involved in the clinical trial process. Is there anything else you could add to that you would?
Yeah, so there are currently, there is currently available in Atlanta the opportunity for expanded access use, and that is currently ongoing. We have at GRU a study which will be 2 subjects, which will be starting as soon as we have DEA approval, which hopefully could be not later this month or next month. There's a larger study which what we have applied to FDA for is 50 patients, which would be done here in Augusta, would be done in Atlanta, and potentially Savannah as well, under the direction of pediatric neurologists at those locations. And that has received verbal acknowledgement from FDA that we're approved to do that. We have not received the formal written approval. We still have the IRB approval, Institutional Review Board, our Ethics Committee approval that has to be completed, and we still have to complete the DEA approval for that. If the 50 children, if that fills up quickly, we are prepared to submit to FDA for approval for another 50 children. And if that were to fill up, we have structure in place to be able to go to more children. The constraints would be availability of medication as well as budgetary constraints.
Okay. That's helpful. Madam Chair, we'll start with you. You got any questions you want?
Yes, I wanted to ask you on that slide number 18 on page 9. I can't barely read that citation on there. Do you know what year that study was, and also the aesthetic research to pull that study? I can barely read it.
Which were you trying to refer to?
The citation, Hill, TDM, Wiley, that's in the British Journal of Medicine, I suppose. No, British Pharmaceutical Society. Do you know what year that study was?
I'm not seeing that study on here. It's slide 18.
It's page 9.
Page 9,
slide
page 18.
I'm sorry. I just wondered what year that was. And I was going to read it. And is that in mice?
Yeah, so that was a study that was presented at the proceedings of one of the scientific meetings, so it wasn't a publication.
It wasn't a publication.
That's not what you referenced here, that's correct.
Okay.
That is a publication. That's a journal in epilepsy studies, and it is studied done in mice.
Could you send it to me?
Sure.
Oh, and send it to me? Do you know what year that was? That was twice?
Yeah, I think looking at the study, it was probably in the last 10 years, but I can't say for certain. Probably I would say 5 to 10 years. And there are many of these types of studies done looking at balance and coordination.
Is this the most definitive one that you've seen?
Well, it depends on definitive, what you mean by definitive.
Well, this is the correlation, as I understand.
This is a study that looks at the coordination
Right,
and how
that's
it's
what,
affected.
and that's one of the things when the parents have testified is that when they go on regular pharmaceutical medications, they either don't work or like you're talking about the efficacy or the side effects are just so bad that they don't want to use them. So I was just wondering if it's like I guess the standard barrier is this the best study of that?
I think that this shows interesting data. It's well powered. It's done by a reputable person, a reputable investigator. I've done these types of studies in mice, not with cannabidiol, but with other substances. And there are different standardized tests that you put the mouse through.
Right.
Now, it's quite different than a child, and I think in a human it's much more diverse.
Okay,
You need to,
I understand.
I think, treat them.
I just wanted, before I go read all these studies, I want to make sure I'm reading the best one. And I figured if you put it in here, it must be a good one.
Senator,
Okay.
it's from 2010.
2010, okay, thank you. So it's not that old.
No.
Okay, we'll open up the committee. I know everybody's probably got, we'll just kind of go online. Dr. Wayne, I'll over you.
Thank you very much. I know we haven't gotten the investigator version presentation yet. We'll probably hear that in a second, I hope. Dr. Parker, I'm sorry I haven't met you. I'm Matt Gwynn. I'm a neurologist in Atlanta. And you're the PI on this study here. And this is going to be not LGS or DS, because those are ongoing at Emory already, and I believe those are being enrolled. What's the
Not yet. There's a practice in north of Atlanta that's rolling now.
Yes, I know that group. Flaminians and that kind of hearing. Okay, so they're going to be enrolling how many?
I'm not sure how many. I think that's the GW study that's
Okay.
open, and I'm not sure how many they've been.
Tentatively, investigative meeting will be held in first week of December for that LGS and Dravet Part 2. They tentatively recruit of 80 patients each arm.
Okay, 80 patients.
National.
80 patients.
Wait, that's 80 patients nationally?
National.
Okay, so meaning how many Georgian?
Depends on how complete with them.
Competitive.
We do have a list of patients waiting for those categories.
Do you have an idea of, that's the heart of the matter. We're trying to figure out how many Georgia citizens are going to be affected here. So I apologize for staying on that, but any idea, you think 5 will get in, 20?
I think it's more than 5 though, because of Flamini is involved in the PI, myself, and the member Emory. So at least 3 institutions has invited for investigation.
No, so that's competitive enrollment probably?
Correct.
Okay, and so it's going to be up to 80 from Georgia if you get a lot of good subjects. And it's a 1-to-1 placebo best
Control dose versus high dose, 3 arm.
Okay, so it's 1-to-1-to-1, and it's going to be
Standard fees, explain that to the committee. Let's make sure.
1/3 of them will be placebo, like sugar pill. 1/3 of them is low dose of CBD. 1/3 of them is the escalating maximum dose we can achieve.
Okay.
That's 3 months. After 3 months later, everybody go to the same amount. Able to.
So someone would be receiving a placebo would be eventually be able to receive it. Okay.
So it's not a crossover, it's actually going to try. And how long will that tail last?
I don't think there's anything limited. So initially it's 12 months and then expanding 24 months.
So, and then it could be compassionate use after that, perhaps.
Compassionate use is already ongoing throughout. So what Dr. Diamond showed, that's the compassionate use of patients. So what he said is he's expecting 2 patients as a compassionate use in Georgia. And then Dr. Franklin is already enrolled several patients from that. So,
and one more thing. The second point, the Senator Underman was alluding to this, was about the brain development and concern that long term with these children who admittedly already have trouble, there's no way to track those people 5-10 years down the road, because once the study is over, presumably there won't be monitoring done. But not that that's wrong, but I'm just saying that's what is going to happen.
So control studies have a protocol for assessment.
Yes.
Our Georgia protocol does not have, because we are not control study. We are open study, means we have a count, we put in the medications.
Oh.
So we don't have all those kind. We do have a questionnaire, but we don't have a scientific way to evaluate what the cognitive effect, etc. But the GW Pharma initiated study is a control study. They have a protocol in it, have assessments of more detail.
Are we going to see your protocol now? Or is that
it's not,
proprietary?
it's not approved, so.
Oh, you don't have the protocol ready today?
We have a very high-level summary that I can't show.
Oh.
The testing committee.
Is this an investigator-initiated study, or is this a pharmaceutical-initiated study?
So, again, there's more than one type of study. There are the GW pharmaceutical-initiated studies,
Right.
which will be done on multiple occasions. And then there are investigator-initiated studies, some of which are compassionate use, or it's now called expanded access, which Dr. Flamini has established on his own. We've applied to GRU for, and there will be a larger study, which is the 50-patient study that I was mentioning, which would be able to be done at all these locations as well as in Savannah, which also is officially designated as an expanded access protocol.
And are you all leading that? Are you the central PI?
That is being led by GRU. Dr. Park is the PI, will be the PI here at GRU, and there will be lead investigators in each of these other locations as well.
So you're still still haven't gotten FDA approval nor IRB approval for this, but you anticipate to. Is that
So for the 2-patient study,
yeah.
we have FDA approval, we have IRB approval, and we have many of the initial stages of DEA approval. We do not have final DEA approval, which we expect literally any day. For the 50-patient study, we have submitted to FDA now almost a month and a half ago. We had a conversation with FDA about that. They asked us to change one portion. We agreed to that. And technically, from an FDA point of view, since we haven't been told no in 30 days we can proceed, but we'd like to get the written formal confirmation that we can do so. We have also submitted for the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, approval. We have not yet received that. And we will be able to, as far as the DEA approval is concerned, we'll be able to take advantage of some of the work that's already been done at each of the locations for the DEA approval, having the research pharmacies already approved and having phase 1, class 1 licenses, so that while we still have to achieve final DEA approval, we will be able to minimize the amount of time that's taken by the fact that at the different locations we will have already put the applications in for early.
The primary endpoint is what? The primary endpoint is what?
Safety and efficacy.
This is a phase 2.
We're going to be collecting efficacy information, but it's technically a phase 1 study.
It's one study.
Yes.
So, I can't just answer one question. You said an open or controlled study.
Sorry?
Who made that decision, whether it was going to be an open or a controlled study?
I'm not sure that the term open. So
phase 1 studies generally are uncontrolled. They're really
Right.
for dosage, trying to find a safe dose.
Right.
Right.
So the earliest version that we had put together of a protocol for the study did have a randomized comparative study.
Mm-hmm.
And based on a meeting that was held just July, just a couple blocks here, which included investigators from GRU, from CHOA and Emory, was there, from Savannah, consultants that came in from New York, as well as representatives from GW Pharmaceuticals. We had multiple discussions running over the period of the next couple of months. We came to the conclusion that the way we could probably best make cannabidiol available most rapidly to the children here in Georgia would be to not have a randomized study, to have a study where everyone was going to be getting the active agent after a baseline period. We're going to collect seizure frequency and seizure type information. And that would be not only everyone going on active agent right away after that baseline period, but also less potential for concerns either at the FDA level or at the DEA level or IRB level for concerns which may hold up the speed at which we can get all those approvals in order to be able to initiate the study.
So, and I guess this, I don't know, we're going to be talking about money and funding. Is that on your agenda coming up?
I did not have that on the slide.
Yeah, I think I asked you that question last night. Can you quantify how much has been spent so far on this process? I mean, we're shooting for a ballpark. Is it 50,000? Is it $500,000? Is it $1 million?
So as I told you last night, we really haven't quantified it in that context. If I were going to try to guess a number, because I haven't gone back to look at it since we spoke last evening, it's $100,000. I said $500,000 to you last night. As I think about that, it's probably, that may be a little bit high. I'd have to look. But in order to do studies, going through all the approvals, what will be necessary for coordinators and the physicians that will be providing the research oversight for these studies, reporting that has to be done. Research, unfortunately, is done well, is expensive.
So when you had
The GW is providing the medication, the Epidiolex, at no charge. They're providing the medication.
Right, so $500,000 is just research cost, manpower related to.
Right.
So when you were sat down with the researchers a couple months ago and you were deciding the type of study, is cost a factor, or you're leaving that up to the General Assembly, or you're the researchers and cost is not a factor?
No, cost is a factor with everything. So we have put together a study in which we have tried to minimize the cost. We can add in
like you were talking about a while ago.
Other things would provide additional information, which from a scientific point of view would be beneficial.
So have you submitted those to the governor's office of the potential cost and OPB?
We have submitted draft proposals to the budget office. There are lots of contingencies here, which has made it difficult. So we don't know how many children are going to be fully approved by all these different groups. We don't know what the requirements are going to be. Are we going to need to add in additional studies that we don't have? Are we talking about 50 children, or if we go to a second group, we're up to roughly 100 or more? We're hoping that these studies will be provide the medication for a year at this point in time. But at that point, the drug may not be approved, it may not be available. So we also have worked on contingencies of what it would cost to continue the study for a second year or for incremental years.
So did the Board of Regents absorb that initial $500,000?
So basically, GRU is fronting those dollars with the hope and expectation that we would be receiving those dollars back ultimately. But our hope was, in order to meet the governor's initiative of trying to move forward quickly and to have the protocol be available to the children as soon as possible.
So if we're sitting here planning on these studies, I know that would be included in the supplemental. So in the big budget, and I think I saw Representative Harvin coming already. I think it's sitting back there actually. But anyway, when we come to the big budget, if we have to insert money into that budget, what would be the ask?
With all the caveats that I mentioned, for 50 plus children for 1 year, the budget for that, as Dr. Whitmore was saying, with the medication being provided at no charge by GW Pharmaceuticals, the drug levels being provided, measurements being provided by them, we're probably someplace in the neighborhood of $7 million, $8 million for 50 children for a year.
I want to make sure we understand it. So that would be what you would potentially be looking to ask, $7 $8 million for 50 children.
Correct.
Sir, what is your screen failure rate estimation?
Well, my expectation is that there won't be many, and until they're in the study, if someone comes in and that they aren't going to qualify or there are other reasons why they decide not to participate, they would not be one of the 50. These are for the individuals who are actually in the study.
Okay, so this is going to go on a year, and you're going to be having frequent visits, frequent EEGs, imaging?
So, no, we don't have frequent EEGs, we don't have imaging as part of the study. if physicians want to do that as part of standard care for the children, it would be. And as far as the evaluation and workup of these children, the thought was they would have already had those things done prior to the time that they would be coming for the study. These are all children who have been treated for epilepsy in the past and been intractable.
So if you have 100 screens, 50 enrolled, that's 70,000 per subject. Sorry.
Most cancer, I thought that it was going to be less because most of our cancer studies that we do, generally phase 1 studies, we can do for $8,000 to $10,000 per patient. When we were designing the study, we were very meticulous about not adding extra studies so that insurance companies, and it's kind of normal standard of care. The only things that should cost extra for such a study are things that are going to be required for extra monitoring and extra care because of this drug. The standard EEG, imaging, MRI, blood work, liver function studies, those will all be considered standard of care. So
but I mean,
I haven't seen the 7 numbers.
I do a lot of clinical research studies and write budgets for them, and I'm not questioning it. It seems a little cheap just because that seems, usually you get about $10,000 to $20,000 per unless there are lots of expenses.
So the difference is that this is not a commercially sponsored study, where the company such as GW Pharmaceuticals is the one paying for all the CRO or clinical research organizational activities. So the state of Georgia is the sponsor for the study, and we are paying not only that we're going to have to come up with expenses not only for the clinical sites that are doing it, which is what I as a clinical investigator most often see, but all the expenses that are related to the clinical research organization. So diaries to be able to track seizures, reporting the information, the biostatisticians. These are all things that are now our expenses because we're collectively the sponsor for the study, as opposed to the site seeing just individual patients with a physician and the coordinator and those sorts of activities. So it's the CRO roles that is probably a big difference.
Okay, let's let another member of the committee. Ms. Beos, or okay, Chuck, why don't you go ahead?
If you could help me understand a couple of things. The actual testing, i.e. the administering of the drug, where will that take place?
The 3 sites, or 4 sites, what I designate, GI.
Where?
In the clinic, in the neurology
Clinic,
clinic.
what you touring this morning.
Okay, here in Georgia, correct?
Yes.
And y'all are comfortable that you can do that under current law?
Yeah.
Georgia law. The cannabis that you intend to import, or the epidiolex, if I'm saying that correct, does it contain any level of THC?
It may have very, very minute levels. Let me go back to your first question, make sure we got the answer right. So dispensing would take place at the Georgia Regents Pharmacy, the equivalent at CHOA, but we would be giving these families medication that they would be giving to their children because you take it twice a day. So we're not asking them to come to the clinic twice a day, every day for the medication. We're going to be giving them a little bottle with like an eyedropper that they'll be giving this as medication to their children at home, wherever that may be throughout Georgia. I do have concern and have brought up at a number of different levels, including our general counsel, of what is it we're going to need to do that if we have these families transporting cannabidiol, although we have the Class 1 license to prescribe it, the Class 1 license to dispense it as physicians, what do we need to be giving these families so that if for some reason they're in a car accident or something and there's law enforcement and they said, how come you have this? They have a letter that explains it. It's something that law enforcement within the state recognizes what it is, and these children, these families will not be in trouble for possession of that medication.
Correct, and that's what I'm getting at is if the substance technically does contain THC, it does violate state law, and that's part of what the legislature is going to be asked to address this coming session. But from your standpoint, you're comfortable on your part of it as opposed to because you've been approved by the federal government to do so and you've got that license.
Well, there already is THC, a form of THC called Marinol that we use regularly in cancer therapy for anti-nausea and appetite stimulant, and that is highly regulated, but that's dispensed and used.
Does the Marinol have THC in it?
It has some THC in it.
And what percentage? Because the percentage that we had talked about in the previous bill was 0.4.
0.3 is the hemp level. What's defined as hemp? We've been looking at anything below 1% as below the psychoactive impact level.
It's quite low. I can't say the specific percent, but I know that some of the children do get a little loopy.
When they're given marijuana.
Yes. Sometimes, and sometimes they have hallucinations. Some kids, it's not, it doesn't affect them at all. But it is a carefully regulated drug, and you need to have a direct dispensing of it with a hard prescription, and you can't be calling it in places. So there are a number of regulations that override that medication that don't override other medications.
Chuck, any other questions?
Well, but to address your concerns that you apparently have already raised, if the legislature were to authorize a provision that said this particular chemical compound with this small amount of THC would now not violate state law to possess if you had some legitimate reason to possess, that would solve your concerns, correct?
And another thing, when you're talking about children and kids, what is the definitive age? I think we talked about 18 and younger.
So the protocol is up to age 18 at the time of initiation of the study, their participation in the study.
They could be 18 at the time of
If they're 17 and 360 some odd days, at the time that they start the study, they can continue it beyond the age, once they reach 18. But if they're already 18, then the way our protocol is written at the present time, they could not. And that again came from what our initial initiative was for children.
I want to hear from Dr. Burke. He's the brains of the Senate.
Okay, let's go down the way here and see some questions from the representatives of Senator Tanner. Dr. Burke, we'll start with you.
I'm actually pretty comfortable with the study issues that we've been talking about. I do want to go back to the THC slide that Dr. Diamond you discussed. There's a lot of discussion about that compound, obviously, as far as trying to expand this law that we're discussing developing, and I'd like to hear each of you on the panel's opinion about where is there a place for that in children at all right now, scientific standpoint.
So I've shared my thoughts on this with time. I'll defer to the others.
So one of the issues in these studies that cite the THC, many of these are all done in animals, and they're done with very high levels. And it's perhaps analogous to when there was a uproar because of Diet Coke causing cancer. Well, that's if a mouse drank 800 liters of Diet Coke in a 4-hour period. So some of these studies really aren't under the physiologic conditions that we would see in children. Now, there is some evidence that THC is also helpful in killing tumor cells, but not normal cells. So I think it needs to be done in a very carefully regulated way with physicians that are used to handling children. They're pediatricians that care for these children, and we do normal standard care as neuropsychiatric testing. So one of the issues with cancer, we're often trying to kill a tumor in the brain of a child whose brain is still developing, and so that's a very difficult therapeutic window. You want to give enough drug to kill tumor cells, or in this case, you want to give enough drug to stop seizures without causing undue damage.
I think the question is the anecdotal evidence of the cannabidiol is wider margin of safety, and therefore, if you were going to do something similar with THC, you would be approaching that a lot more carefully than even that we're talking about.
Correct, and I think the reason that we are so much in favor of Epidiolex is because it has a very minuscule amount of THC. Unlike some of the artisanal home extractions, they have more THC, and we're concerned about that, especially being if it's not a consistent regulated level. We won't know if an adverse effect is due to that contaminant, or if the same plant, if the same clone of cannabis is grown in different soil, you're going to have a different concentration. So even if they do use the same clone in Mississippi, it's going to have a different concentration than it does when grown in the UK. Different pH soil, different amount of sunlight.
That's like Vidalia onions.
Exactly. Exactly. So you want to make sure that you have a consistent onion. Yes.
Dr. Burke, no. President County?
Well, now we're done.
Okay. President Grant, Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, who wants to go?
Thank you all so much for your testimony. Are there any studies
conjunction with the Epidiolex studies that would indicate that the Epidiolex study has a low risk to kids over time. But the Epidiolex study itself doesn't have a detrimental brain effect over time.
So I shared with you what was presented at the press conference last month as far as side effects that they were observing, with the most common being somnolence and fatigue. And they also described that there was no serious adverse event that was attributed to the medication. Those studies were not designed to have, first of all, they were short, what they're describing as short duration, up to 16 weeks, but they were not designed to have components that were looking at MRIs or other functions as a reportable component of what they were, of the data that they were collecting, that I'm aware of.
So,
over 300 children have received Epidiolex, and there have been no significant, a very low number of adverse events. Some of those are thought to be due to the seizures and aspiration of liquid, not thought to be attributable to Epidiolex. So it's felt that it's generally has been a safe compound when used by skilled physicians.
yes, and if I may, those 300 children, what was the time frame? Which, I mean, I guess is that over 5 years, 3 years, 2 years?
That's GW data. I think that also includes perhaps some 50 children in Europe. I'm not sure, but about 300 U.S., 3 to 350 U.S. patients, children in the U.S. I think it's over the period of
I don't think it's 5 years. I think it's probably less than that.
2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years.
That is my guess.
Anything else? Commissioner
Anything else?
Not this time.
Senator Johnson?
I have one last
Okay,
question.
sure.
Right, so the money, I like talking about money. So I have to sit there, do the budget. The $7 to $8 million, that would go to Georgia Regents University.
It would come to Georgia Regents University, and then that would be dollars that we would use to compensate Dr. Park for TCs, places that are seen at CHOA, that are seen at Savannah, all those locations. It would go.
So it's a misnomer to say that it would just be going to Augusta. It's going to be spread throughout the state with patients.
It would flow through us, but it will not all be spent in Augusta. That is
Right,
correct.
it goes throughout the whole state.
Right, and part of that distribution will depend on where these children end up enrolling.
Right.
If there are more children at CHOA than there are in
That's very
Augusta,
important.
and
For
have
us
a
to
larger.
try to get that approved when we're
Yep.
sitting on floor of the Senate,
Yeah.
and people think that it just goes to Augusta.
We're serving as the sponsor, where we will be paying all the bills that are being
Right.
incurred regardless of where
Administration.
those patients are being seen. So we'd be paying.
So would it be a separate line item through the Board of Regents, or is it a separate line item completely?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it'd be coming directly to.
I would hate to say this, but I hate to put it to the Board of Regents. I'd rather see you have a line item.
That's above my pay grade.
I think Dr. Wayne had another question. Dr. Park, could we go back to, could we go back to the slide about the 58 anecdotal patients with the response rate of response rate?
Sure. Do you have what slide that is?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sure.
Just help us get there quicker there.
I should have looked. Okay, here we go. Slide number, page number 13. It doesn't have a slide number. Bottom of 13.
Page slide.
So, Dr. Park, what is in general epilepsy studies, AEDs, what is the response rate in most of those trials in patients for AEDs?
For other common AED,
Yes, sir. Like
I
Dr.
didn't see any new AED like that kind of seizure freedom achieved except one medication, which is settling.
That's very good procedure.
But all other AED, new AED, usually don't have that kind of high instance of percentage response. Usually 40, less than 40, 33.
So the response rate in general, when Lamictal came to market and so forth, was approximately 40%, correct?
Less than 40 to 50% reductions.
About 30 to 40 though, isn't that right? And this is an anecdotal evidence that shows similar data. Is that correct?
More than the 50, and then seizure freedom about the 10%.
But not exactly. Remember, these are children that already were on 3 anti-epileptic agents. So these individuals fall in the part and the group of children that in Dr. Park's pie chart, where he showed the benefit with the first agent, benefit with the second agent, and then the bottom thing around 7 o'clock, say when you had the third, fourth, fifth agent, very few of them, very, very small increases in benefit. I think it's 1%, Dr.
Right, I'm not talking about net after placebo. I'm talking about all respondents looking at a study.
But these are only those who are, this is looking at those people that have already been on 2, or in this case 3, and now you're adding yet another agent. So, if you will, those who have a propensity to benefit have already been removed from this population.
Maybe I have a better question, Dr. Park. In LGS studies, that's a better way to say it. In LGS studies, what is the response rate to an added new IND?
There's a 2 study was approved. One is OMPI, clobazam.
That's a good example, OMPI.
Yeah. And then the other one is the severity-wise is a drop attack is much better responder, like a 50% responder. So when we see the drop attack,
We go to the next slide, please.
Responder drop seizures.
One more.
Drop seizures.
So you're saying it's a much better.
Yeah, Lennox-Gastaut is the most worst scenario, but drop seizures may be worse. So, but
the preliminary data, anecdotally, is that it's better than what we have currently.
And then side effect profile is.
And the side effect profile is better. Okay, thank you.
Let me just ask one final question if I can, and I'll put Dr. Whitmore, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Parker on the spot. Because you guys are actually seeing patients. If it was the public policy of this study to allow medical cannabis oil to be grown, manufactured, processed, and delivered to citizens in our state, and we could do it in a safe manner, and obviously there are some issues making sure that it's processed and it's consistent, and we do determine it's legal through what the Justice Department has given us guidelines for. Would you recommend it to citizens in our state? Would you recommend it to your patients? And if you're comfortable saying that, if you're not, I don't understand too, but
I have limited information that you see here, same thing. I will say yes, but I still be cautious because we don't have any placebo control study yet.
Okay.
Therefore, you have to be careful. Sometimes the open study saying that everything's good, but when you do the actual double-blind study, surprisingly, placebo effects so beyond beneficial. So we have to be careful of that.
Okay.
Until then, I cannot say yes, but likely, but we need some data.
Okay. That's a fair response.
I think it's very critical for the safety of our children to do it to give such a compound within the realm of a clinical study, so that we're able to document the safety and efficacy. Even such supplements as St. John's wort. Children have died from liver failure, that and adults as well. So I think to give something as powerful as cannabidiol oil really needs to be done initially within the confines of a clinical trial, so that there are medical professionals able to help these children monitor liver function, monitor their psychiatric outlook, so that we're able to do it safely. These children have developing brains, and we want to enhance the development as much as possible and not do anything to harm them. So I would only do it within the realm of a clinical study until it's been proven safe.
Can I just ask one last question, just to make sure I understand? In my mind, I'm thinking these kids that would enter into this program are quote-unquote virgins, because they would not be on any existing medication, right? You were talking about they may be on 2 or 3. Do they come off of those medications?
So no. So
They stay on their existing medications, so you're adding to it?
That's correct. So
how do you do an analysis of one may be on 2 medications, one may be on one? How do you correlate that?
So the FDA, as it has been looking at these trials, has provided guidelines that as to what they want to see in order to look at the agents that fall into the anti-epileptic categories. And what we have been told is that they want to be looking at individuals who are on, to call them intractable epilepsy, to be on at least 2 agents and still having high frequencies of seizure activity. To take them off those medications runs the risk that they'll go back to where they were before they were on those medications and make them even worse. So the way that you do those sorts of studies then is you know what a baseline is. For our study, we're going to have a baseline period where we're going to observe seizure frequency, and that's on the standard medications that they're on. And then to that, we will be adding the cannabidiol, the CBD, and be able to assess is there a difference in seizure frequency.
So there really would not be a child that had intractable seizures that's not on medication that would be presenting to you. Is that correct?
Correct, because if almost by definition, if they're having lots of seizures but they haven't been treated yet, they're not yet intractable.
Right.
Intractable means that they've been
Right. Okay. I got it in my head.
It's all the more reason because they're already on very serious medications. It's all the more reason that it has to be done in a very careful situation and watching their blood counts, liver function, elimination, food, feeding, all of that needs to be done very carefully.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This goes a little bit back to Alan's question about the access to the cannabidiol. Are there not circumstances where the seizures are just so serious and already causing so many problems that you have the study going on? That is, there not, in your opinion, also situations where you really could go ahead and have access to that and monitor those kids? I mean, is there not enough damage already being done that you couldn't do both, have access and monitor and do the clinical trial? Or even if you had a clinical trial, cannabidiol oil, is there not a way to sort of have access to that and monitor those kids who really otherwise have to have surgery?
Well, it's not really thought to be ethical to give an unknown, uncharacterized substance. You can't, it's not really ethical to give that as a treatment when it hasn't been shown to be effective. So I think that the best way is to give these families access to it in a supportive and knowledgeable environment so as not to cause any more damage to their brains. Because if you're just taking extra, even calcium tablets, people think natural is better, coral calcium. You get toxic levels of lead in the brain. Natural calcium is not better. Tums is safer. And so the families, they don't have the medical background to do it in a safe way, most families.
Well, and that goes to my question, how are they doing it then in Colorado? I mean, it's obviously being monitored and some people are having great benefit from it.
I think they're often seeing their physicians and there are pediatricians there that do take the patients and they see the patients on a regular basis and they help monitor those things outside of a clinical trial because it's legal there.
Actually, the next 2% are going to give us information. Let me Dr. Whitmore, Dr. Clark, thank you for what you're doing for the children of the state. It's clear that you care about these kids, and at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to get to too, is how do we help them improve the quality of life for the families. So thank you for taking the time to be here too. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, we're going to plow ahead. And our next presenters are Dr. Terry Hines, who's a neurologist from Colorado, and Jason Cranford, who's a botanist from Colorado as well too. I believe they have an interesting perspective of what we're discussing today. So, gentlemen, if you'll come forward. I think we have 2 mics up there available for you. So if you'll both tell us who you are, and we're sure it will. Those down there. Identify yourselves and your expertise.
Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Dr. Terry Mark Hines. I'm a board-certified adult neurologist, but I also have treated children now for approximately 30 years with all types of epileptic syndromes. I practiced in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which is in the extreme west part of the state of Nebraska, and covered approximately 10,000 square miles for approximately 20 years as the only neurologist in that area. So I had the experience of treating all forms of epilepsy in both adults and children during that period of time. In 2007, I moved to Colorado. I continued to practice neurology in Nebraska, in the underserved area of Valentine, Nebraska, which is in central Nebraska, in the very northern part of Nebraska, right at the South Dakota border. I became interested in this subject when I was listening as background to a program on CNN called Week 2. And Dr. Sanjay Gupta was doing a documentary on this story, and I was listening, but I was in the kitchen cooking actually, and I was just listening to the presentation. And they had been interviewing Dr. Orrin Dubinsky at the University of New York, a notorious epileptologist there, and he was talking about his experience with GW Pharmaceuticals and his initial experience there, and he thought there was very good value in what was happening there. There was a cutaway to a commercial, and when they cut back, they were interviewing Dr. Margaret Getty from Colorado Springs, and she made a comment that caught my ear. She stated that it's a shame that many of the pediatric neurologists who are hired by the University of Colorado are reluctant to become involved in children's care because of the sticky wicket of the Schedule I classification at the federal level of this product. But she stated that it was to the children's detriment that they were not receiving specialist care and that they needed pediatric neurology. Since I had vast experience, though admittedly I'm not a board-certified pediatric neurologist, I contacted her and I asked her if I could volunteer to job shadow, so to speak, and try to get a better feel of what was going on in the area, because I was an independent physician and I didn't have to answer to a federal government employee type situation. So I did that, and because I divided myself into the situation where there were 2 doctors, and in Colorado it requires 2 physicians to approve or recommend medical marijuana for children, I went to the clinic that was doing that the most. They had set up a clinic in such a fashion that the children could be seen in the same day by 2 different physicians. Midday, I asked if I could start interviewing myself, asking some questions to the parents, and they agreed to that. And my first question was, what does your physician think about what's going on here? You've brought your child here. And many of the parents said, we're scared to tell our doctor because we are afraid the doctor will abandon us. That was one common response. And there were even concerns that the physician would report them to Child Protection Agency. And because of that, the parents had been alienated from the doctor-patient relationship, or in this case, in the doctor-parent relationship. And my heart went out to see these parents that are desperately trying to do the best thing for their children, and seeing that the first mandate of a doctor is first do no harm. And we were clearly doing harm as a profession, as doctors, by abandoning patients in their greatest hour of need. You're not talking about some theoretical, evidence-based science here. We're talking about parents who have decided to split the family up and bring their children to Colorado because they're absolutely desperate about taking care of their children. In the slide presentation by Dr. Diamond, there was a mention of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. We don't get to choose and pick when that death occurs. There are no take-backs to death. And the parents are faced with a syndrome that is known to increase your risk of sudden unexpected death if the seizures continue. I've been here listening to the presentation. I would like to make some comments. In 1984 to 1987 timeframe, we had about 4 anticonvulsant medications that could be used either individually or in combination. And it was from that point forward, because of the very ethical issues that were addressed, that we needed to do studies for new and better different combinations. But we didn't want to have a child taken off of a drug and then put on a drug that could conceivably not help at all. So it was from that point forward that all studies in anti-epileptic medications from that point forward were done as an add-on type study. You're on drug A and you have drug B added to that. And all of the drugs that have been approved from that time forward have been approved in that context. Later, sometimes what happens is the patient's been on drug A and B and drug C was added and there is complete control. And in that situation, maybe at that time it's appropriate to stop drug A and B. And then we find out, yes, drug C sometimes works as the primary and only drug. And so later drug companies may come back and say, now we want to approve it as monotherapy or single agent therapy. And that's been done for many of the drugs. We have to see this issue in the context of other medications. And the committee has been struggling with understanding that. One of the points that Dr. Diamond tried to make was that the children were already on 2 or 3 drugs, and the diminishing returns that occur in that context are very significant. But the studies that I'm talking about for these other drugs that were approved were done so with a different cohort of studies. These were done in people that were having 2 or 3 seizures perhaps a week, or 2 or 3 a month. We're not talking about that population. We're talking about a population of children that are having seizures up to 80 times a day. And it's very easy to see the results when a child goes from having 80 seizures a day, and there's a 42% reduction, they're down to 20 seizures a day, or they're down to 10 seizures in a week. So there's a dramatic reduction. There's been a mention that one of the most severe epileptic syndromes is called drop attacks. Now, I'm going to put it in context. In 30 years, I've seen 4 people die of sudden unexpected death. One of the patients was a patient of mine for 10 years. He had a drop attack, and he hit the concrete, and he got a spinal cord injury, and he lived with quadriparesis for more than a year. He eventually had a fairly good recovery to his cord. But the point is, it's a dangerous syndrome. Many of these children have to wear helmets because they fall unexpectedly and they get injured that way.
Let me, if I can, if you'll fast forward to kind of what you've seen in your evaluation of patients in Colorado at this point. How many you've seen? What has been the efficacy of the process?
Thank you, sir. So to put it in context, they've been talking today about expanding access studies for Epidiolex, where we are looking at one specific agent in one specific context with specific inclusion criteria and specific exclusion criteria. One of my patients is 19 years old. He would be excluded, but he's having 20 seizures, 30 seizures a day. He spends about a week a month in the hospital because of his severe epilepsy. And he would be excluded from that study. His guardian doesn't want to wait until the studies are done. And so they are faced with other choices that are very difficult. When medications fail, the child is often offered the option of having a surgery. That is irreversible. That has life-threatening, real risks of infection or complications that can't be reversed. There are other ways to try and intervene, such as the vagal nerve stimulator. I've had experience with that device for 14 years. The manufacturer themselves does not even claim that it will eliminate all other medicines. And maybe what it will do is reduce the number of medicines, which is a very significant thing over a period of lifetime of the person. Less burden on the organs, for example. But it is not a comprehensive therapy at this point that is satisfactory. We're talking about patients that are getting unsatisfactory results. And we're seeing, unfortunately, we've seen that there's an exodus from states like Georgia, but Texas or other states, to Colorado. And it's not just because they want to get on the product alone. They know that there's limited access to the product as it is now. They want to get put on a waiting list. And they're fearful that if they wait too long, it will be too late.
Now, I understand you're involved in a study at Colorado State University, is that correct?
That's correct. I helped draft initial efforts at what we are calling an observational study. And the entry point to that study is after the parents themselves have already decided to start their child on CBD oil. So we are not advocating that they do that. We are simply accepting that that is a real reasonable option parents have chosen. And from that point forward, hopefully, if the study is adequately funded, we will be able to observe data. That is very important. Everything that you have asked for, which is rapid access to be able to treat these children, safety, monitoring, being able to monitor the inventory, I believe all of that can happen for Georgia. I totally support the idea of doing studies like the Epidiolex study. I can't comment on the cost of that study because I'm not expert in that area. But what I can tell you is that parents bringing their children, they are bearing the cost of separating their family. And the cost to separating the family is not measurable in dollars alone.
Okay. Let's, I know, J.C. Bamford, you came and visited with us last time, and Dr. Nguyen had lots of questions about, are you seeing any evidence from the EEGs? What's your specific question? And I think do you have any data? I think that was some of the... Well,
again, the limitation here is the fact that it remains Schedule 1, and so there's conflict and there's fear of reprisals for at all kinds of levels. So we don't have the type of data that we would like to have, but I believe we have our clinical data, and the clinical data tells us that when children are started on CBD oil, very frequently there's a dramatic response. And sometimes without adequate oversight by physicians and experts here, the parents are stopping the other anticonvulsant medications. I believe that's very dangerous. We've learned over 20 years that could precipitate continuous seizures to death. And I wanted to see that that didn't happen. I wanted to see that every child that was being, the parents were choosing to go down that pathway, that they hadn't overlooked the possibility that a diagnosis had been missed. There are some things that cause seizures that can be very severe, that can be totally reversible. For example, vitamin deficiency, toxicities. There are other issues that are sometimes not addressed. And the parents need guidance. They need doctors that do not feel that their license is going to be on the line. They need the support. And it is reasonable to consider these options because of the dramatic response we see. If you look at the efficacy of all the other anticonvulsants that have been added in the last 25 years, all of them show 20-30% reduction in the frequency of seizures. But these are in people who have much less severe seizure syndromes. So it's like comparing, I like to say, comparing STP for race cars versus STP for antique cars. It's not the same ingredient in the same study.
Okay.
And you have to take it in context.
I know we got a couple of questions. Did you get a question?
Yeah, who is the state of Colorado funding that study? Who is funding that study?
There is approximately $9 million available to the state of Colorado through the Department of Health and Environment, and there have been...
Where's the $9 million come from?
Comes from the Red Card Registry. So
what?
The Red Card Registry, when the patients get 2 doctors' recommendations in Colorado, they can sign up for what's called a Red Card. Red Card allows them access to purchase medical cannabis. The money used from that registry was used to fund the $9 million research grant.
So did the state front the money? I mean, that money's being collected because it just went into effect, right? Did they front the money or said?
It has not been earmarked yet this time.
So the state hasn't funded it?
That's correct.
So did they have a constitutional amendment that set up that money to go directly into that fund? I mean,
they did.
They did, and it passed.
Yes.
Was that part of the legalization?
I believe it was part of the recreational legalization.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yes, it was. It was part of the recreational legalization.
Then it had to go into R&D?
Exactly. So the money was used from the registry, from the medical registry, to fund research studies.
So the study hadn't started then?
Correct.
You hadn't collected enough money, right?
No, the money's available. The money should be issued January 1st.
So is it going through a university system?
Correct.
Study?
Correct. CSU applied for the grant money to do the study, the observational study, and right now the state of Colorado is reviewing the application.
So they're setting up their protocol just like we are.
Exactly, and we're collecting the data in the meantime. We're gathering the patients and collecting data.
Do you have, do you have any data that you can share with us today that would provide any evidence that there's positive impact from cannabis oil that's similar to a Charlotte's Web or Hay soap that's being used out there now?
I do. I've been collecting data for the past couple of years. I've been reading CBD genetics for 5 years. About the last 2 years, I've been actually collecting data. And if we look at the presentation, I know it's kind of small, but we've outlined some of the one of the sentences. So basically, I'll let Dr. Hines explain this more, but we're seeing a huge increase in her treating and the brain activity after they're administering the CBD oil. This patient in particular was a 2-year-old little girl. Pre-CBD treatment, she went in to get her EEG done, and her Hertz reading on her brain was in between 2 and 3. So I would say that's 2.5. After the CBD started, a couple of months later, she was taken back into the hospital to have another EEG performed, and her Hertz reading had increased to 5, where 6 is a normal reading. So, Dr. Hines, you can comment on this if you like.
May I just say, Dr. Graham, give it a little EEG background. So an EEG is simply a way of recording the electrical changes in the surface of your brain as measured from your scalp. Anyway, you normally between, say, 6 and 13 changes per second. For children, it's a little different. Anyway, slow background activity is associated with a lot of different things, but one of the things is encephalopathic epilepsy. So when the background improves, assuming it's consistent over time, that's a good sign. Of course, what's most important is the clinical features, as I know you all were talking about. The observational studies, just to clarify, you have not started that yet. You're just contemplating it, or you're
That's correct. But I'm following several patients clinically because their families have chosen to start the children.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely not discounting that, but I'm just saying that so you don't have data to present today. I appreciate that you came, and it's really important to hear this, but you don't have 20 patients that you said I've looked at them beforehand. I've put them on something. Their parents have sort of monitored their progress and told me about things. You don't have that.
Let me go back and just say, like, I'll present a particular case as an illustration. The child arrived in Colorado on 13 different medications.
Yes.
Now you saw from Dr. York's pie chart graph that the chance that you're going to improve the child's seizure disorder by adding a third drug is less than 5%.
Yes, I understand all that. That's not what I'm asking you. You said that, and I appreciate that. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that
to have that child go to 3 drugs in less than 4 months and go from 80 seizures a day to 10 in a week.
It's a dramatic, but we asked, I think we were expecting, and perhaps wrongly, that you would be bringing information about finding results. They don't have to be published, but results that you had over time of a number of people that you had followed over time, and you could tell us about. This is, coupled with, we already know about Dr. Ms. Cox and so forth, and that's wonderful. But so that you don't have that with you today.
Okay. Because some of the children that I'm seeing have already been on the oil for 6 or 7 months when I saw them for the first time. And some parents have already elected without medical guidance to discontinue some of the medications. So we're not controlling at this point what's happening. We're simply observing.
For that, right? I don't think anyone expected a kind of control thing. Right. We just wanted. I was hoping that we'd be able to say you'd be able to put out the EEG before and after and that sort of thing. I thought that's what we were going to see, but that may have been my own mistake.
So this is one of the EEGs, the most impressive, where the Hertz reading was increased. This is another EEG on a patient that I've been treating for about 6 months now.
What's the baseline on that as far as the seconds? That looks like a beam study of some sort, brain electric mapping, very, very, very many
Help put that in layman terms.
Yeah, so I have to look at this really quickly. This is really complicated, so I'll have to take that. But I'll believe you that there's no reason to disbelieve you that this young woman had a very slow background. You put her on this medicine. Within a month, it looks like she had a little bit better organized background rhythm, and that's a good thing.
Correct.
That's one.
As you know, some epileptic syndromes show continuous abnormality in the electrical activity, continuous seizure-like activity throughout the entire evening when the child is asleep. There is what appears to be ongoing epileptiform activity. And to see that totally eliminated is a dramatic result. We don't see that with other...
This Ms. Warrior actually wasn't totally eliminated, but she still had multifocal generalized spike discharges that were still there. It was better, I agree with you. I'm not trying to be a bad devil's advocate, because as I've said to this committee and many times, my own son was in this situation. I would have done anything for him, including this. I'm just trying to say, I just want to make sure that when we're talking, that we're giving validity for where validity is due, and we're leaving open-ended things for things that should be open-ended. That's all I want to say.
And sitting right in the same chair, Dr. York showed you the algorithm. Park showed a slide, and he showed first we treat with multiple anticonvulsants, and then the algorithm went on down to include vagal nerve stimulator. It included all types of epilepsy surgery, and it was he who showed the slide that has CBD as the next option reasonable to reasonable people. If you have a choice of putting your child on an oil that has been shown to be reasonably safe up to this point, with the limited data that we have, versus operation, what parent wouldn't want to have that option to be able to put their child on it and not have to wait to be involved in a study? What we do know about epilepsy is that the longer it goes uncontrolled, the worse it gets, and the more damage it causes to the brain. There was a question about the mouse study, for example, about the mouse walking on a tightrope, so to speak. But many of these children can't walk at all because they're confined to wheelchairs. Many of the children are so advanced in their illness that they are fed continuously by tubes going directly into their stomach. They quit eating months ago. They quit drinking months ago. So we're not talking about just a little bit sick here. We're talking about the sickest of the sick children.
Sure, I think everyone here understands that these are horribly sick children who are going to not respond well to anything extra, and that this may very well be an extremely effective treatment. And I hope that it is, and it does seem from what the testimony we heard today that it's probably safe. We haven't proved its efficacy. For one thing, in my opinion, we have not yet proved that what the safe dose is. What's the tolerable dose? That's what the phase 1 study is supposed to do. It's supposed to give almost none, some, a whole lot, really a whole lot, and see what's safe. That's what the phase 1 study does. That's the kind of information we need. Maybe we can't wait until that. I don't know. That's a political question. But as far as the safety of patients and children in Georgia, I think we need to answer that question. What I was hoping from this is evidence of something that you could have put forward. And maybe you will have that. This sounds like a really good thing for us to have CSU follow-up, in 6 months to hear what happens. That would be a wonderful thing.
I would agree completely. As I understand it, Alan was proposing that this would be in parallel with the ongoing best evidence type studies like the Epidiolex study. There's no reason that you can't pursue two avenues at the same time, and I think we should be doing that. I totally advocate doing scientific-based studies. In the meantime, you don't wait to try and intervene for a child that is so critically ill. We lose them to death.
Dr. Glenn, I would like to ask something. So what is the difference between this EEG report on the screen now, and this is pre-CBD treatment,
right,
and then this EEG, which is...
Okay, those are apples and oranges, mainly because what you showed the first one has the baseline. Okay, an EEG is simply, just take one line, 2 wires over part of the head, and you measure the difference of voltage between those over time. So time is along the bottom,
and the difference in voltage is the line, the change in the line. So all you're trying to do is see what the pattern is. This EEG, to me, I can't quite tell. It sounds like it's in half-second increments. I'm not really sure, so it's really fast along there. And so it looks really kind of flat, or it looks, I can't read it because I don't know what the horizontal axis is. But anyway, that just shows some kind of central spike, generalized spike of some sort, occasionally going on, probably epileptic, but hard to say. The second one does seem to show relatively good sleep architecture. It looks like a drowsy person, maybe even in stage 2 sleep with sleep spindles. What that means is that this looks like a fairly normal EEG for some people. It depends on the stage. You can't really tell with one page. You need to see the whole 20-minute. I think all the neurologists here would agree with that.
You have the full copy in front of you.
Yes, so...
why don't you take a quick look at that?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, Mr. Kramer, you were here last time and you testified that you're providing a Haley's Hope strain. It's called strain of cannabis oil called Haley's Hope.
Yes.
It is high in CBD, but has some amount of THC. Yeah, right. I guess up below a 1% level. And you've seen how many of these patients out there?
Around 200.
Okay. And obviously it's not a clinical trial. It's done like an FDA-approved clinical trial, but you are seeing evidence that there is significant seizure reduction. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I've been breeding these strains for about 5 years. Just because I'm put in the medical marijuana category does not mean that I only breed THC strains, contrary to popular belief. So I've been breeding CBD strains for 5 years. I've isolated CBD and a number of genetics. Here's a lab report on one of the strains where I've isolated CBD. I've grown the THC completely out of the plant. You can see the THC is the green dot, and usually a strain, this chart will be totally CBD and remove the THC from the plant, which is really similar to Epidiolex at 98% CBD.
And this product that you've been given to these 200 children, I guess, is that mostly children or all children?
It's mostly children.
And it is lab tested for pesticides, tested for mold, tested for mildew.
Right. We use independent labs. We do microbial testing, heavy metal testing, and solvent residue testing. And no matter what type of extraction method you use, CO2, butane, alcohol, there's always some trace residuals left. And so we've designed an extractor that runs off of organic vegetable oil, such as sesame seed, safflower oil, coconut oil, and that eliminates the residual solvents in the finished product.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
It seems to me, and I'm just a layperson, just more to serve the general assembly, but you said you've been working on it for 5 years, and it seems like Colorado, Washington, things Oregon, California has medical marijuana. Why is it the state of Colorado did not come forward just like we are? It seems like the state of Georgia has done this at lightning speed. I mean, we've done this in the last six months. We have made tremendous strides. So you've been working on this for 5 years. Why did someone at Colorado University, Colorado State, or some Stanford, Stanford's out there in California with medical marijuana, why has someone also not worked at some other state, not worked at lightning speed like we have to generate money? I mean, we're going to be lobbying for money. Why have you been working on it for 5 years and nobody's done any clinical trial?
Actually, about 5 years ago, I met a woman named Sarah Russo, who is the daughter of Ethan Russo, the head scientist with GW Pharmaceutical. So I followed their product, Sativex, for the past 5 years. I looked at several of the research studies, and I followed the work of Dr. Raphael Meshulam out of Israel. I've been reading his studies since 2009. So I think the answer to that is I was just a little ahead of the curve.
But why didn't the state of Colorado, did you not market it to some university, or why did they not do the same thing that we're doing?
They wouldn't touch it because of federal funding issues.
But this is state money that we're lobbying for.
Yeah, but the universities rely on federal funding, so the state of Colorado just got their...
I don't believe that. I mean, I go to national conferences and every state funds their university.
Well,
They do get federal money and they get matching money from grants and
I
whatever.
think the issue is are they going to jeopardize the federal funding to do
Yeah,
something?
Oh, you're saying, but aren't we risking it too?
Yes.
Yes. You're
So
risking
why
everything.
didn't Colorado, who's so, I guess that's my question, all these states are more progressive because they actually legalized marijuana. So if they're so progressive, why did they not take the same risk that we're taking? That's my question.
I would like to know the answer to that too. I'm not part of Andy's university, so I can't really answer that question. I wish they would have, taken the same initiative
Yeah, I wish
and
they would
aggressive
have
approach that Georgia
taken
took.
we could follow behind them.
Yeah, exactly. They could have led the way with the charge, but Georgia is doing something that most of the other states have not done, and we're bringing this into a university-based research. You guys are ahead of the game out there.
Yeah, and that's my question. Why has it taken us 6 months and you've been struggling for 5 years?
Another thing was the funding. So in Colorado, we didn't have the funding. He was mentioning $7, $8, $9 million in funding to do this. It's very expensive to get these universities involved and all the doctors that have to monitor the patients. So Colorado didn't have the funding until this year. So they just put forth the initiative to divert some of the money from the registry into funding these studies.
I want you to make a couple of final comments if you have some, and then we're going to have a couple real quick questions from the panel for both of you. That's okay. Any final comments that you'd like to add?
I would just like to address the fact that standardized doses of medicine is very easy to achieve. The repetitive standardized dose is just like the doctor was saying earlier, is you take a clone off of a plant and you preserve that genetic profile. So creating a standardized dose is not that hard. It's very easy. You do large batches, so all the doses are standardized. You do analytical reports. HPLC machines will identify the cannabinoid profile, and that's easy to recreate. Even if it's 1 point off, it's still easy to alter the oil to get it standardized. So it's the same batch over and over and over again.
So consistency in the product,
Correct.
as well as testing for purity of the product.
Correct. You don't need a $50 million lab facility to create a standardized dose.
Yeah, hang on 1 second. Any other comments? I won't stop while you're on. So.
No, we're open to questions.
The CW data we saw indicated 15% of tolerance roughly in their pills. Is that about what you have, or do you have data on that?
We strive for closer to 3%.
3%, so you're closer to a brand name sort of tolerance rather than generic, which is 20%. Yours is 3%.
Correct. I'm also a consultant in a state that has to follow pharmaceutical protocol. So all of our standards, all of our medicine has to be within 3% of the last batch. So we've narrowed it down to achieve that goal.
Thank you. Any other questions? Senator Thompson?
I think maybe this question is more for Dr. Hines, but I think what the crux of it is, at least for me, is that we're pursuing this one track, or at least talking about pursuing this one track of these clinical studies so that we can find out what's going on. I think that's all well and good. But if you've been sitting here the whole time, I think some of the concern that I've heard is that at some level it's limited. I mean, there's only going to be so many people available, and you've got a number of people. There's never going to be enough studies for the number of people who are going to be asking for this, at least not immediately. And then the question becomes with the quality of life of some of these folks, if you're having 20, 30, 40 seizures in an hour, or even in adults. We're talking about kids here, but depending on the illness, and if you get away from epilepsy and you're talking about late-stage cancer and stuff, you're talking about quality of life at some point. Whether or not we should actually be pursuing 2 tracks. Do the clinical studies, absolutely, but whether or not we should be making this available under some sort of limited circumstances, or some sort of, whether there's a referral or however it's going to be set up, so that people who can't be in the study, whose quality of life issues are so severe that as you were putting about it, sudden death is an issue, or it's terminal. I mean, depending on what illness you're talking about. Is that basically what Colorado is now? I know you argue who's ahead of the curve, behind the curves. Colorado is now basically doing this 2-track model. So they're going to.
That's correct.
And is medically, is there a problem with doing that? I mean, that's the question. I guess that would have been my question for Dr. Westmore if I And I'm sorry, time was of the essence. Sure, we're trying to get us out here before 5. That would have been my question for her. That's my question for you.
And the answer was, in the slides, there's about 6 epileptics per 1,000 population. About 20% of those are refractory or not responding to multiple medications. That results in 93,200 people approximately in the United States in that predicament. And you're talking about doing studies for perhaps as many as 200, perhaps as many as 400. That still leaves 92,000 people having not had access to the drugs. I do believe what will happen is what is happening in Colorado. If it happens in Georgia, you will have observational studies as well. You'll be able to glean that data.
So you could do both. I mean, because the idea would be to have a situation so people could still continue seeing their pediatrician and not fear of defects being called, and then we start getting the data to find out.
That comes down to not either or mentality. It's both makes good sense. And I think it makes good medicine. I think it can be safe. I believe it can be monitored. I don't believe it adds an extraordinary burden to drug enforcement agencies. I think they should accept that burden easily if it makes for families that can stay united.
I agree. I think that's my concern, is that if we just go with clinical only, we're never going to get, we're going to be dealing with a lot of folks who still either need to move, because you're dealing with folks who have run out of other options, or they wouldn't be asking to be on a wait list here at GRU, or there wouldn't be a wait list longer than any possible version of study that I've heard done here. So the wait list is already, or the people asking to be on the list are already longer than the number of studies that we're going to study slots that we could possibly have according to prior testimony. So that is a concern of mine, especially when it says that folks have run out of options by the time they're asking about this anyway.
There is this issue of what's called the entourage effect, described by the original person who discovered THC and then later was involved in understanding the endocannabinoid system of the human body. And he believes, to this day, that there are factors that we do not completely understand, where there's some type of interactivity of the cannabinoids, or perhaps some of the other ingredients in the plant called the flavonoids, or the terpenes, that these other chemicals in some way enhance the effects of the CBD. And at this stage of the game, to pick one and only one strategy seems to me to be a mistake, when in fact we can design rational protocols where what I would want done for my child, if they couldn't be in the study, and would be to place them on CBD, and then very carefully and cautiously, if they weren't having a good result, consider the option of adding small amounts of THC and escalating the dose. And I believe you can draft legislation that will allow enough leeway in the oil arena and still make it to where it's not going to be a product that would be abused. And there is lots of evidence in California that it seems to be a fairly reasonable something.
Okay. Any other questions, real quick?
Thank you, gentlemen. I had asked the GW study in a 2 to 3 year time frame, with the answer was 3 to 350 folks here in the States have been seen and monitored in that time frame. Mr. Cranford, you said that you had treated 200 individuals here. So that's in Colorado, correct?
In Colorado, and almost a dozen of them
from Georgia. What is the time frame? Over what time frame have you seen this? Is that 2 years, a year, 6 months?
It's about a 2 year period.
So it's about a 2 year period.
Yes, sir.
And so the same thing I'll ask you. They have not seen any harmful side effects, detrimental side effects. Have you seen any detrimental side effects?
No. The biggest side effect that I've seen is a lot of the kids will become hyperactive through the use of CBD. If the CBD to THC ratio is too high, the kids will become hyperactive and they don't sleep as well. out of the 20 or so children that I've given the isolated CBD to, all 20 of them reported back increased seizures, and they brought the medicine back. The entourage effects, Dr. Hines and Dr. Sanjay Gupta speak about how the cannabinoids work together. If you remove one of the cannabinoids out of this, like a race car engine, you take a gear out, and the engine doesn't work as well anymore. And we're seeing that same effect with the oil. When you isolate a certain compound, it just doesn't have the same effect as the whole plant extract. And so actually, one of the patients that I'm treating from Georgia, this patient, we gave her isolated CBD, and it just didn't work. She regained seizure control with her. She went, I think, about 8 days without seizures. We gave her the isolated CBD that was around 98% pure CBD, and it had a really negative effect. Her seizures came back almost immediately within 24 hours. So what we're seeing is that you do need some level of THC to effectively stop seizures. And then I would also like to point out with the trials here, according to the Epilepsy Foundation, last time I saw there was over 100,000 seizure-based disorders in Georgia. The small amount of people these studies are going to be pulling on is not really going to help Georgia citizens. The kids are going to be left out in the cold. Sure, a few, 50, 100, 150 people might be enrolled in these studies, but what about the other 90-something thousand seizure cases in Georgia? What are they supposed to do? And FDA clinical trials takes 5 to 7 years, so this product's not even going to be available for,
Actually, that number's 150,000. Yeah. Let me, one quick question before you get out of here. Obviously, you have a business enterprise model in Colorado. Does a business model work in Georgia if it's public policy of the state to provide medical cannabis oil with a high CBD, low THC strand? Is there enough demand? Does a business model work to do it in Georgia?
Absolutely. In Colorado, I'm the founder of a nonprofit, the Flower and Fruit Foundation. But as a for-profit model, it is sustainable. You're dealing with 150,000 or so patients. It's a sustainable business model. It would be profitable. I chose not to go that route in Colorado, but in Georgia it would be profitable. And for law enforcement, we use a system in Colorado called MITS inventory tracking, where we use RF frequency ID tags that get strapped to every single plant. And law enforcement can pull up outside of our group facilities with a scanner and actually count our plants from outside the building. They knock on the door, they come in, they have the right to search at will with no search warrant. If they come in and every single plant in that plant is not tagged, somebody's getting arrested. So it's very easy to track the inventory. We have to weigh everything on camera. We send in reports daily to the state to show them where our inventory shows.
Pretty intense security. Right. Dr. Hines, Mr. Kramer, thank you for being here. Appreciate you traveling a long way to be with us. You twice, so we're glad to have you back in Georgia. So thank you. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Members of the committee, we got one more very important person going to come visit with us, Dr. Peter Buckley, who's the Dean at the Medical College of Georgia. Georgia Regents, Dr. Buckley, if you want to come on up, you're going to be our last presenter. I'm glad to have you here. I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Buckley several times, and appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
Thank you. Peter Buckley is my name. I'm Dean of the Medical College of Georgia, Georgia Regents University. And I guess the first thing I wanted to say is thank you for the privilege to our institution and to our city of being here today. I've not been here for all of the event. I've actually come in from Atlanta, but from what I've heard, this has been a very good dialogue on a complicated issue, and we're privileged to be able to host that. I don't intend to go into the details because it looks like you've had a good discussion of that and you've had people that are far more expert than I. Just want to kind of reiterate that we feel we have some role, but a relatively small role to play in a complex issue. We're privileged to be on the threshold of helping children in Georgia and intend to do so in a way that's inclusive and across the state, not just in Augusta, not just exclusive to GRU, but rather to be an asset to the state, which I think is really our role as the state's public medical school. So we feel privileged, and you heard from Dr. Diamond the state of development, and want to assure you that Dr. Diamond, Dr. Park, and our team have put in a lot of work. It may not seem so by the number of patients and the stage we're at, but it does take a lot of effort to get that far. We also recognize the shortcomings of what we're doing, and we're just contributing one part to a much broader societal picture that's playing out across the nation, but also playing out well in Georgia. And appreciate Representative Peake. We've been on panels together, and this is a good dialogue for our state, and we appreciate what you're doing, and we appreciate the broader advocacy, and appreciate the efforts of family members to get the help that they need. And as I said, we feel privileged to be able to be part of that. We also hope that despite the warts and all of any clinical trial, it's never perfect and it's complicated in this particular arena. But despite all of that, we hope that not only will what we're embarking on be helpful to people directly, but we also hope it will inform the debate that will be ongoing both in Georgia and across the nation. So we feel that is another little part that we can add to this puzzling situation, and we're committed to doing that as expeditiously as we can, and with the kind of high quality research that you'd expect from your state's medical school. There are all the remarks I have, sir.
Any questions?
Just want to say thank you.
We're glad to have the medical college is in such good hands. Really, thank you. So appreciate you being here.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, member of the committee. Let's before we go, we got one person that kind of coordinated all this at the end of the day. Where's Margie? Margie, let's thank you very much. Medical professionals here and get them on time, so thank you for doing that. Any other comments? No, Sherry, you got anything you want to share?
No, I hope everyone has fun Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing everybody on December 3rd. We'll send out information, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.